Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, January 25th, 2020. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we restart our webinars after a short break. We now commence with Phase 6 and the 28th webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee. I am turning the webinar over to him now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. It is a great pleasure to be with you and with our other colleagues today. This is indeed our first webinar in the year 2020, and although several weeks have already elapsed into that year, I suppose I'm allowed to wish everyone a happy new year. A friend of mine commented that this year is bound to improve our vision because everything we look at will be 2020. In any event, here we are, and I would comment to those of you who may not have been following our series that it is predicated on a long document of mine called Revelation Revealed. More recently, we have begun discussing an insert to that document called Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Living the Real Religion of Jesus will be more useful for your purposes today because we will get into that document a bit later. I recommend that if you do not have it to hand, that you download it from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle of it. The link for Living the Real Religion of Jesus is about 2/3 of the way down on the left side of the page, and the link for Revelation Revealed is there as well. Now, because you are not going to have the opportunity to ask us any questions while we are conducting our webinar, we do offer you the possibility of sending us in a question or two by email. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address at the bottom of the homepage of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, which is info@globalendeavor.net. If you send us a question and we decide to use it on the air, we reserve the right to edit the wording. And in that event, you would get an answer, or at least the question would be answered by all the participants that day, not just by me. So now we will proceed to the substance of our discussion today, and I have to explain that I am going to deviate from our usual pattern of discussing the document, in this case, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, based on our previous discussions during Phase 5, which ended in the middle of December. It seems to me that there is now the moment in which I should deliver extended comments from my own perspective. And I will proceed to do that. I have prepared a written text, which I will read in cooperation with our colleagues, whom I will ask to take turns in reading the excerpts from the Urantia book that are part of this essay. So my essay is called Perspectives and Prospects, and I will now begin reading it. In our series of webinars, we do our best to embody and demonstrate pluralism and diversity. Is that just a peculiarity of mine, or does it stem from motivations that are far deeper? To me, this commitment to pluralism and diversity bespeaks our firm intent to dismiss and reject the insistence on uniformity of observance and belief that has pervaded religion and spirituality in the Western world for the entire 2,000 years that have just ended. As a practical matter, you have clearly adopted this perspective, for all of you have cooperated with me in conducting our webinars entirely in this spirit. Therefore, in my role as the moderator, I have sought to stimulate you by asking questions, although I am quite willing to concede that many of them have been leading questions and that some of them may even have been tendentious, as one of you has asserted on more than one occasion. Nonetheless, I have encouraged you to express your own views and have emphatically sustained your right to do that, even when I do not agree with you on some specific feature of our deliberations. Today, however, I shall depart from this standard pattern, mainly because I believe we have reached a point that justifies extended comments of mine. I assure you, however, that these remarks do not oblige you and that you are free to take issue with any aspect of them at your discretion. Today, we are conducting our 28th webinar on topic 8 of my long discussion document, Revelation Revealed, a topic that is entitled Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. As you are well aware, the many pages that remain ahead of us imply that we will still be immersed in this topic for quite some time. And this prospect is one of the key factors that led me to decide to speak to you in this vein. After all, the revelation we are studying is not purely spiritual. It is spiritual, mindal, and material. The revelators did not solely exude an updated vision of goodness. To the contrary, they portrayed our planet and all mankind as benefiting from God's loving ministry, devoted to a balanced blend of truth, beauty, and goodness. On the understanding that personality creates the context for the choices and decisions whereby human beings accept or reject the possibility of eternal existence. A divine counselor tells us, and now we have a quotation from paper 2. I would request George to read these 2 paragraphs, please.
Great mistake of the Hebrew religion was its failure to associate the goodness of God with the factual truths of science and the appealing beauty of art. As civilization progressed, and since religion continued to pursue the same unwise course of overemphasizing the goodness of God to the relative exclusion of truth and neglect of beauty, there developed an increasing tendency for certain types of men to turn away from the abstract and dissociated concept of isolated goodness. The overstressed and isolated morality of modern religion, which fails to hold the devotion and loyalty of many 20th century men, would rehabilitate itself if, in addition to its moral mandates, it would give equal consideration to the truths of science, philosophy, and spiritual experience, and to the beauties of the physical creation, the charm of intellectual art, and the grandeur of genuine character achievement. Religious challenge of this age is to those far-seeing and forward-looking men and women of spiritual insight who will dare to construct a new and appealing philosophy of living out of the enlarged and exquisitely integrated modern concepts of cosmic truth, universe beauty, and divine goodness.
Thank you, George. Those 2 paragraphs that you have read come from section 7 in paper 2 by a divine counselor. In my opinion, these rather pointed remarks actually understate the case. If you pick up a copy of the Urantia book and open it to the table of contents, a casual glance suffices to establish that religion is not the sole topic that the revelators analyze and explain. For example, the revelators have given us considerable information about the material universe and how it operates, contents that can be broadly described as science. Further, in part 3, the authors devote considerable attention to the history of humanity from a spiritual and social perspective. In paper 52, Planetary Mortal Epochs, a mighty messenger tells us that our world is, quote, a full dispensation and more behind the average planetary schedule, unquote. Paper 52, section 3 by a mighty messenger. Thus, it is obvious that we, the people of Urantia, have a huge backlog of unfinished tasks. With all this in mind, The revelators have explained in considerable depth and with complete clarity that life on Urantia and on other inhabited planets is an evolutionary process in which human beings are responsible for participating intelligently and actively. In other words, we, the people of Urantia, must take responsibility for our own planetary destiny, at least in large measure and to a very substantial degree. After all, we are not marionettes fastened to some set of strings that God is manipulating from a supposedly golden throne in heaven. So why are we devoting such an extraordinary amount of time and energy to comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity? At first glance, this seems surprising, for my fundamental objective associated with Revelation Revealed was to seek to stimulate substantially greater interest in aspects of the fifth epical revelation that have not been entirely neglected, but have seldom served as a basis for personal engagement and active effort. From this perspective, why not accelerate rapidly through topic 8 so as to devote the savings in time and energy to aspects that reflect my broader interests and objectives? For example, topic 1 of Revelation Revealed provides considerable insight into the overall process of epical revelation as it has unfolded on Urantia. And topics 3 through 6 consist of a detailed analysis of the idealistic and altruistic initiative that my colleagues and I refer to as the global endeavor. Further, topics 9, 11, and 12 are quite innovative. They appear likely to increase understanding of intriguing mindal and spiritual realities among readers of the Urantia book who have not devoted substantial attention to these matters. Topic 9, comparing and contrasting the ministry of the guardian seraphim and the work of the master seraphim. Topic 11, the ongoing evolution of the human mind as a crucial contribution to more advanced levels of society and civilization on our planet Urantia. Topic 12, promoting understanding of, loyalty to, and active cooperation with God immanent, especially via our close association with God the Mother, the Supreme Being. To be sure, the idea of accelerating rapidly through the rest of topic 8 may seem sensible on the surface. Over the past few years, however, I have finally absorbed the net implications of the colloquial phrase, "You cannot get there from here." In other words, I have come to understand that in order to carry out effective efforts to attract considerably greater attention and interest to aspects of the fifth epical revelation that are innovative and at least relatively new, I must contend with certain preoccupations and interests among quite a few readers of the Urantia book living in North America that would have to become less intense and less absorbing. In effect, colleagues, we are talking about readjustments that may eventually persuade them to reevaluate their personal loyalties, priorities, and attachments, as well as their existing commitments. In seeking to explain this transformation as tactfully as possible, perhaps I have implicitly reverted to patterns of behavior that I sought to embody during my former career as an apprentice diplomat. Under the current circumstances, however, I realize that I cannot be quite as indirect and must instead identify the issues more explicitly. Perhaps the following excerpt from section 10 of paper 195 will serve as an apt introduction. And now we have a paragraph by the Midwear Commission. I request that Stephen read that for us.
The praiseworthy desire to preserve traditions of past achievement often leads to the defense of outgrown systems of worship. The well-meant desire to foster ancient thought systems effectually prevents the sponsoring of new and adequate means and methods designed to satisfy the spiritual longings of the expanding and advancing minds of modern men. Likewise, the Christian churches of the 20th century stand as great but wholly unconscious obstacles to the immediate advance of the real gospel, the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Paper 195, section 10.
Thank you. From these perspectives, I have concluded that I will not succeed in my efforts to stimulate considerably greater interest pardon me, I will not succeed in my efforts to simulate active interest in aspects of the fifth epochal revelation that are innovative and new, unless I can find ways to dispel, or at least to undermine and diminish, illusions that have appeared to be prominent among a significant number of readers of the Urantia book living in North America. Illusions effectively implying that the fifth epochal revelation is an outgrowth of Christianity, an appendix to Christianity, or perhaps even Christianity 2.0. Now, since the statement I have just made is rather complicated, it may not have been luminously clear to you when you heard it so rapidly. Therefore, I shall remedy that by subdividing the sentence. Is the fifth epochal revelation an outgrowth of Christianity? No. Is the revelation an appendix to Christianity? No. Well then, does the fifth epochal revelation amount to Christianity 2.0? No, most certainly not. Thus, my three answers are no, no, and no in that order, but you are entirely free to rearrange them in any other sequence that you happen to prefer. Christianity's fundamental flaws. Although the various strands of Christianity include more of Jesus's teachings than any other organized institutional religion, they also include a great deal that Jesus did not teach. The most deplorable accretion was the atonement doctrine that the Apostle Paul invented, an appalling distortion that overshadows the entire Christian tradition, while also misrepresenting and perverting the nature and character of God. A divine counselor condemns this concept, and it is difficult to imagine any verdict that is more emphatic. There follows here 2 paragraphs from paper 4 by a divine counselor, and I request that Marvin read these 2 paragraphs for us.
I'd be glad to, Neil. The barbarous idea of appeasing an angry God, of propitiating an offended Lord, of winning the favor of deity through sacrifices and penance, and even by the shedding of blood, represents a religion wholly puerile and primitive, a philosophy unworthy of an enlightened age of science and truth. Such beliefs are utterly repulsive to the celestial beings and the divine rulers who serve and reign in the universes. It is an affront to God to believe, hold, or teach that innocent blood must be shed in order to win his favor or to divert the fictitious divine wrath. The bestowal of a paradise sun on your world was inherent in the situation of closing a planetary age. It was inescapable, and it was not made necessary for the purpose of winning the favor of God. This bestowal also happened to be the final personal act of a creator son in the long adventure of earning the experiential sovereignty of his universe. What a travesty upon the infinite character of God. This teaching that his fatherly heart in all its austere coldness and hardness was so untouched by the misfortunes and sorrows of his creatures, that his tender mercies were not forthcoming until he saw his blameless son bleeding and dying upon the cross of Calvary.
Thank you,
So,
Marvin.
Paper 4, section 4, paragraphs 4 and 6.
Yes, thank you. Since the divine counselor's rhetoric is elevated and eloquent, that factor may tend to obscure how intense and how pervasive these teachings are. In fact, they constitute the core the center and core of the traditional Christian faith, as is clear from colloquial statements such as these three. Quote, Jesus died on the cross for our sins, unquote. Quote, Jesus is my personal redeemer, unquote. And quote, Jesus saves, unquote. Further, the cross or crucifix serves as an omnipresent symbol that represents Christianity as a faith and as a tradition. As appalling as the atonement doctrine is, it was not the first major mistake that the early Christians made. To the contrary, on Pentecost Sunday, the Apostle Peter inadvertently launched a religion centered on the story of Jesus, a religion about him, instead of a religion focused on his actual teachings. As the Midweek Commission tells us in section 6 of paper 138, Jesus explicitly warned his apostles about this. One paragraph now from paper 138. Andre, would you please read that paragraph for us?
Sure. Jesus endeavored to make clear to his apostles the difference between his teachings and his life among them, and the teachings which might subsequently spring up about him. Said Jesus, my kingdom and the gospel related thereto shall be the burden of your message. Be not sidetracked into preaching about me and about my teachings. Proclaim the gospel of the kingdom and portray my revelation of the Father in heaven. But do not be misled into the bypaths of creating legends and building up a cult having to do with beliefs and teachings about my beliefs and teachings. 138, 6.3.
Thank you. Jesus also warned his followers against formulating creeds and traditions that would serve to guide and control believers. Here we have two paragraphs from section 5 of paper 141. Bob, would you please read these two paragraphs for us?
Sure, Neil. Your spirit unity implies two things, which always will be found to harmonize in the lives of individual believers. First, you are possessed with a common motive for life service. You all desire above everything to do the will of the Father in heaven. Second, you all have a common goal of existence. You all purpose to find the Father in heaven, thereby proving to the universe that you have become like him. Many times during the training of the 12, Jesus reverted to this theme. Repeatedly, he told them it was not his desire that those who believed in him should become dogmatized and standardized in accordance with the religious interpretations of even good men. Again and again, he warned his apostles against the formulation of creeds and the establishment of traditions as a means of guiding and controlling believers in the gospel of the kingdom. Paper 141, section 5, paragraphs 3 and 4.
Thank you. It is clear that Jesus was advocating complete religious freedom, the individual's right to reach spiritual conclusions and formulate religious beliefs based on his or her personal experience. In contrast, the techniques that Jesus warned against amount to monolithic practices aimed at promoting uniformity, a pattern whereby the group exercises authority over the beliefs and actions of individuals. This, of course, is exactly what happened. That amounts to an irony, an anomaly, or even a paradox. For during Jesus's first discourse on true religion, he told the apostles and evangelists that the religion that he and they would soon proclaim in Palestine contrasted very substantially with the religion of authority that the religious leaders in Jerusalem maintained and promoted. This new religion, he said, quote, shall derive its authority from the fruits of its acceptance that will so certainly appear in the personal experience of all who really and truly become believers, unquote. This segment that I have just read comes from a longer paragraph from paper 155, section 5, and I ask Stephen to read that paragraph for us.
Oh. Jesus went on to say, at Jerusalem, the religious leaders have formulated the various doctrines of their traditional teachers and prophets of other days into an established system of intellectual beliefs, a religion of authority. The appeal of all such religions is largely to the mind. And now we are about to enter upon a deadly conflict with such a religion, since we will so shortly begin the bold proclamation of a new religion, a religion which is not a religion in the present day meaning of that word, a religion that makes its chief appeal to the divine spirit of my Father, which resides in the mind of man, a religion which shall derive its authority from the fruits of its acceptance, that will so certainly appear in the personal experience of all who really and truly become believers in the truths of this higher spiritual communion. Paper 155, section 5, paragraph 12.
Thank you. To make the contradiction even more obvious, we need to remember that those wielding ecclesiastical authority in the Jewish community of Palestine, in other words, Annas, Caiaphas, and the other members of the Sanhedrin, eventually conspired to have Jesus executed, although they were compelled to resort to the Roman authorities in order to achieve their aims. Nonetheless, this riveting example of the flagrant abuse of ecclesiastical authority did not serve as a salutary lesson for the Christian tradition as it developed in subsequent centuries. To the contrary, Christian observance and belief has been dominated throughout the last 2,000 years by a self-selected and self-serving elite who have claimed and exercised the authority to tell others what they must do and what they must believe, while accompanying their peremptory instructions by assertions that disobedience would anger God and that he would punish them for it. Now, I realize that the Protestant reformers of the 16th century repudiated many accretions that had been propagated by the theologians and leaders of the Roman Catholic Church in the course of the preceding 1,000 years, such as the doctrine of indulgences and the many superstitions associated with Mary, the mother of Jesus, for there is nothing in the Urantia book that predicates or implies any spiritual role for her. On the other hand, the Protestant reformers emphatically reaffirmed the atonement doctrine, and they certainly did not abandon the traditional approach of centering Christian observance on certain key events of Jesus' life, especially those celebrated on Christmas Day, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday. In addition, the Protestant reformers did not disentangle themselves or their followers from the syndrome of clerical authority and theological uniformity that has pervaded the Christian faith ever since the Emperor Constantine and his successors adopted a range of imperial policies that eventually made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. Further, in their zeal to reject the doctrinal accretions and self-serving abuses that had become embedded in Roman Catholic practice over the previous centuries, the Protestant reformers did not go far enough and did not reject them all. One prominent example pertains to the dictatorial authority over marriage and family life that the Roman Catholic Church began asserting around the year 1000 CE. Up until then, marriage had remained a matter of folk customs that varied from place to place according to the practical circumstances of life then prevailing in the diverse domains where Western Christians lived. Although it would be rash to assert that all these customs were equally fair and equally effective, there was no crisis and no compelling reason to impose uniformity. In effect, marriage and family life were treated as civil matters that did not justify or require any active involvement of the organized institutional church. This diversity of custom and practices appears to have offended Roman Catholic theologians, for it did not gratify their addiction to ecclesiastical authority and doctrinal uniformity. From their autocratic perspective, it was annoying that folk customs and practices pertaining to marriage did not revolve around the church, nor reinforce clerical domination over civil society. Therefore, Roman Catholic theologians and leaders began inventing promulgating and enforcing detailed procedural requirements and numerous practical restrictions that made marriage impossible for persons who were even distantly related. Although it is difficult to appraise the degree to which Roman Catholic theologians living around 1000 CE were motivated by theological reasoning and/or by factors that really did relate to the welfare of individuals and groups in civil society, there can be no doubt that one teaching that subsequently became traditional, the assertion that marriage is a sacrament instituted by Jesus Christ, is ludicrous on its face. On that basis, Jesus's parents, Joseph and Mary, could not actually have been married, for their family relationship could not possibly have stemmed from the supposed sacrament that their firstborn son subsequently established. Further, the Apostle Peter could not have been married either, even though 2 verses in chapter 4 of the Gospel according to Luke mention his mother-in-law. In other words, Luke chapter 4, verses 38 and 39. What also seems evident and indisputable is that the many rules and regulations about marriage that Roman Catholic clergy adopted and enforced had the net effect of earning the church steady and substantial income, as well as quite a bit of landed property that donors eventually decided to bequeath. After all, a lawsuit under canon law whereby a believer sought an annulment or requested an exemption from some onerous requirement had to be adjudicated in an ecclesiastical tribunal, proceedings that tended to be complex, time-consuming, and expensive. Further, the plethora of procedural requirements and practical restrictions pertaining to marriage, when combined with relatively short lifespans and high rates of infant mortality, led to many situations in which a landowner had no, quote, legitimate heir, unquote, whom he could identify in his will. When he passed away, the property in question would automatically revert to his liege lord or to the crown, unless the landowner decided to bequeath it to the church or to some religious institution such as a monastery so as to earn merit in heaven. Under the circumstances of the Middle Ages, many of them did this, and the church grew extremely wealthy. Now, I realize that what I have said in the last few paragraphs may seem to evoke the archaeology of previous centuries of Christian observance and to have little relevance today. Not so, for all Christian denominations continue to claim authority over marriage and family life, thereby echoing and perpetuating the arbitrary decision of the Roman Catholic hierarchy to invade these key domains around the year 1000 CE. For example, recent news reports indicate that the United Methodist Church, operating in the United States, has announced a tentative plan to become disunited in May 2020 in order to split into 2 denominations. Why? Because many traditional Methodists insist that marriage must be reserved for unions between one man and one woman, whereas many other Methodists, undoubtedly influenced by recent trends in civil society, appear to be willing to accept the concept that marriage can be predicated on the union of 2 persons of the same sex. I shall not comment on the underlying substantive issues, for that is not my purpose today. To the contrary, my theme is closely associated with process, and in this case, the 2 factors that the United Methodist Church and all other Christian denominations inherited from traditions of Christianity that became entrenched and pervasive long before the Protestant reformers of the 16th century endeavored to transform Christian belief and practice. 1, the premise that an organized institutional church has the authority and right to adopt and enforce detailed rules and restrictions associated with marriage and family life. As previously explained, this conviction descends from arbitrary decisions that Roman Catholic theologians and churchmen made around the year 1000 CE. 2, the premise that all members of an organized institutional church must conform to its specific doctrines and practices, even on matters that appear to be more closely related to social norms and customs than to the true teachings of Jesus. As we discussed at much earlier stages of our series of online seminars, this conviction descends from the traditions of authority and uniformity that have infected the Christian faith ever since it became the state religion of the Roman Empire. In other words, the United Methodist Church could resolve its current dilemma and thereby remain united by deciding that the church will no longer adopt or enforce rules and restrictions pertaining to marriage, thereby withdrawing from this domain and enabling believers to pursue approaches that civil society authorizes. Alternatively, the United Methodist Church could resolve its current dilemma and thereby remain united by shifting toward pluralism and diversity, thereby abandoning the traditional insistence on authority and uniformity. If that were to happen, Methodist believers and members of the clergy could act on matters related to marriage and family life at their discretion and as they see fit. Well, colleagues, I shall not conspire to delude you by predicting that either of these obvious solutions will actually be adopted. The path forward. I am convinced that readers of the fifth epochal revelation should focus on the true teachings of Jesus instead of the traditions and doctrines that have grown up about him. Although you are undoubtedly familiar with the underlying principles, the following three excerpts seem to highlight the key factors. We have three quotations. I will divide them up into different of you reading them, please. Bob, would you read the first paragraph taken from paper 195?
Sure. The religion of Jesus does indeed dominate and transform its believers, demanding that men dedicate their lives to seeking for a knowledge of the will of the Father in heaven and requiring that the energies of living be consecrated to the unselfish service of the brotherhood of man. And as you said, 195, section 9, paragraph 6.
Thank you. Andre, would you read the next two paragraphs? They are taken from section 6 of paper 155, and they are Jesus speaking.
I have called upon you to be born again, to be born of the Spirit. I have called you out of the darkness of authority and the lethargy of tradition into the transcendent light of the realization of the possibility of making for yourselves the greatest discovery possible for the human soul to make, the supernal experience of finding God for yourself, in yourself, and of yourself, and of doing all this as a fact in your own personal experience. And so may you pass from death to life, from the authority of tradition to the experience of knowing God. Thus will you pass from darkness to light, from a racial faith inherited to a personal faith achieved by actual experience. And thereby will you progress from a theology of mind handed down by your ancestors to a true religion of spirit, which shall be built up in your souls as an eternal endowment. Your religion shall change from the mere intellectual belief in traditional authority to the actual experience of that living faith which is able to grasp the reality of God and all that relates to the divine spirit of the Father. The religion of the mind ties you hopelessly to the past. The religion of the Spirit consists in progressive revelation and ever beckons you on toward higher and holier achievements in spiritual ideals and eternal realities. Paper 155, section 6, paragraphs 3 and 4.
Thank you. George, would you read the next excerpt, which also comes from section 6 of paper 155?
It is not so important that you should know about the fact of God as that you should increasingly grow in the ability to feel the presence of God. When you once begin to find God in your soul, presently you will begin to discover him in other men's souls, and eventually in all the creatures and creations of a mighty universe. But what chance does the Father have to appear as a God of supreme loyalties and divine ideals in the souls of men who give little or no thought to the little or no time to the thoughtful contemplation of such eternal realities? While the mind is not the seat of the spiritual nature, it is indeed the gateway thereto. Paper 155, section 6, paragraphs 12 through 13.
Thank you, George. On the other hand, an appropriate emphasis on personal individual religion does not mean that we should rule out suitable methods for group observances, for many people find group prayer and group worship inspiring and helpful. Inventing these new methods will challenge humanity's resources of imagination and originality, for group observances must cease to serve as an excuse that enables some self-selected elite to assert institutional authority and endeavor to enforce doctrinal conformity. A brilliant evening star tells us, and now Marvin, would you read the quotation from paper 87, section 7?
I'd be glad to, Neil. And just one preliminary comment, they use the word cult in here, and it might be interesting to think of like a spiritual symbolic culture is what they're trying to get at. We've had other discussion about this. So regardless of the drawbacks and handicaps, every new revelation of truth has given rise to a new cult. And even the restatement of the religion of Jesus must develop a new and appropriate symbolism. Modern man must find some adequate symbolism for his new and expanding ideas, ideals, and loyalties. This enhanced symbol must arise out of religious living, spiritual experience. And this higher symbolism of a higher civilization must be predicated on the concept of the fatherhood of God and be pregnant with the mighty ideal of the brotherhood of man. Paper 87, section 7, paragraph 6.
Thank you. In the same section of paper 87, the brilliant evening star also states, Stephen, would you read actually both of the quotations that follow, which are relatively short?
But a religious cult cannot be manufactured, it must grow. And those of no two groups will be identical unless their rituals are arbitrarily standardized by authority. Paper 87, section 7, paragraph 3. The old cults were too egocentric. The new must be the outgrowth of applied love. The new cult must, like the old, foster sentiment, satisfy emotion, and promote loyalty. But it must do more. It must facilitate spiritual progress, enhance cosmic meanings, augment moral values, encourage social development, and stimulate a high type of personal religious living. The new cult must provide supreme goals of living, which are both temporal and eternal, social and spiritual. Paper 87, section 7, paragraph 7.
Thank you. During our previous online seminars, several of you commented on the importance of teachers and leaders who will seek to attract interest in the fifth epochal revelation and stimulate active commitment to the teachings of the revelators. I must tell you, however, that my personal reactions are really quite mixed. Therefore, I am compelled to equivocate and hesitate. If these teachers and leaders were to operate by means of the approaches and practices that have prevailed in the past, then my answer would be no, absolutely not. Instead, the role of a teacher must be reoriented and redefined. Rather than attempt to impart facts, theories, or interpretations, a teacher should endeavor to evoke, enhance, and reinforce a lifelong commitment to learning and personal growth, a commitment that features an inquiring mind and an active search for new meanings and values, a search that entails consistent and persistent exploration. In principle, this is not very different from what Socrates was endeavoring to achieve in ancient Athens. Further, the new model leader must operate in ways that are cooperative, collegial, consensual, and inspiring, while abandoning and resolutely disavowing any inclination to exert authority, issue commands, or otherwise attempt to insist on uniformity of belief or practice. On a far more general level, Melchizedek declares, quote, "There is great hope for any church that worships the living God, validates the brotherhood of man, and dares to remove all creedal pressure from its members," unquote. Melchizedek, paper 103, section 5, paragraph 12. Although it may be overly optimistic to believe that any existing denomination of the Christian tradition will be able to remodel itself along these lines, we can be confident that these approaches will prevail during generations and centuries that succeed the current era. Broader perspectives. I am not indifferent to the concerns that one of you expressed about the pitfalls of converting the fifth epochal revelation into an object of veneration and evangelizing on its behalf along the following general lines. Quote, "There is this amazing revelation and you have to read it," unquote. As a practical matter, however, such misadventures can easily be avoided if readers emphatically reject the illusion that the Urantia book is a quintessentially religious work, and that all the other topics that the revelators analyze and explain are just curiosities that they have interwoven for decorative embellishment or narrative variety. Not so, for the revelators have implicitly restored and revitalized the standard approach to epical revelation on an inhabited planet, a synthesis of many methods whereby the revelators do their utmost to advance and upgrade all aspects of society and civilization, not just spirituality and religion. After all, God chose not to create a perfect world for human beings to live in, or such circumstances would be no credit to us. Instead, he offers us the opportunity to cooperate with him by doing all we can to foster the slow and gradual ascent of human traditions toward higher levels of material, intellectual, and spiritual achievement. Along the way, we will be obliged to overcome the accumulated backlog of unfinished tasks that still afflict us because of the Caligastia betrayal and the default of Adam and Eve. Melchizedek has been exceedingly frank about the situation that affects us now. Here we have 3 paragraphs from paper 99, section 1. Bob, would you please read these 3 paragraphs?
Sure, Neil. Mechanical inventions and the dissemination of knowledge are modifying civilization. Certain economic adjustments and social changes are imperative if cultural disaster is to be avoided. This new and oncoming social order will not settle down complacently for a millennium. The human race must become reconciled to a procession of changes, adjustments, and readjustments. Mankind is on the march toward a new and unrevealed planetary destiny. Religion must become a forceful influence for moral stability and spiritual progression, functioning dynamically in the midst of these ever-changing conditions and never-ending economic adjustments. Urantia society can never hope to settle down as in past ages. The social ship has steamed out of the sheltered bays of established tradition and has begun its cruise upon the high seas of evolutionary destiny. And the soul of man, as never before in the world's history, needs carefully to scrutinize its charts of morality and painstakingly to observe the compass of religious guidance. The paramount mission of religion as a social influence is to stabilize the ideas of mankind during these dangerous times of transition from one phase of civilization to another, from one level of culture to another. From a Melchizedek, paper 99, section 1, first 3 paragraphs.
Now, even though the revelators have not explicitly informed us that during the 3rd decade of the 21st century, we would be subjected to the multifarious online escapades of geeks, hackers, and trolls, it is quite possible that they really did foresee this. We can be confident that intelligent and insightful human beings will eventually find appropriate ways for us to overcome these particular challenges, along with many others. Another Melchizedek, or perhaps the same one, informs us. Here we have a paragraph from paper 103, section 6. George, would you read that paragraph for us, please?
Man experiences matter in his mind. He experiences spiritual reality in the soul, but becomes conscious of this experience in his mind. The intellect is the harmonizer and ever-present conditioner and qualifier of the sum total of mortal experience. Both energy things and spirit values are colored by their interpretation through the mind media of consciousness. Melchizedek, paper 103, section 6, paragraph 6.
Thank you. Here I shall seize the opportunity to remind you of a statement by a divine counselor that we considered near the beginning of this essay, quote, "The overstressed and isolated morality of modern religion, which fails to hold the devotion and loyalty of many 20th century men, would rehabilitate itself if, in addition to its moral mandates, it would give equal consideration to the truths of science, philosophy, and spiritual experience, and to the beauties of the physical creation, the charm of intellectual art, and the grandeur of genuine character achievement." A Divine Counselor, paper 2, section 7, paragraph 9. For these and other reasons, I am convinced that the Revelator's painstaking attention to the diverse interactions of matter, mind, and spirit is neither accidental nor casual. To the contrary, the Revelators appear to be communicating crucial realities about the finite realm that humanity needs to understand and absorb. In the second paragraph of paper 30, a mighty messenger comments. Andre, would you read that paragraph, please?
Certainly, it is not possible to formulate comprehensive and entirely consistent classifications of the personalities of the grand universe because all of the groups are not revealed. It would require numerous additional papers to cover the further revelation required to systematically classify all groups. Such conceptual expansion would hardly be desirable, as it would deprive the thinking mortals of the next 1,000 years of that stimulus to creative speculation, which these partially revealed concepts supply. It is best that man not have an over-revelation. It stifles imagination. Paper 30, introductory paragraph, or introductory section, paragraph 2.
Thank you. On the surface, the mighty messenger is simply stipulating that there are certain gaps in his description of the personalities of the grand universe, an explanation that would be entirely coherent and persuasive if he were defending a PhD dissertation. If we consider this paragraph more deeply, however, we seize the underlying point that seems far more substantial. The Revelator's desire to stimulate creative speculation among the thinking mortals of the next 1,000 years. And it is reasonable for us to identify that as one of their fundamental objectives. In sum, I believe that the Urantia book is an integral part of recovering from the Caligastia betrayal and the default of Adam and Eve. I believe that it will contribute to an even longer series of adjustments that will eventually return Urantia to the ranks of inhabited planets entirely in good standing. Planets that benefit from the visible presence of accredited representatives of the spiritual government of the universe of universes. If we examine all these factors from a cosmic perspective, we can certainly hope that human beings living on Urantia in distant future ages will justify the complete confidence of our celestial supervisors in the ultimate evolutionary triumph of the human race and the eventual vindication of the original plans and life patterns that the life carriers prepared. Now, since my last few statements have been rather complicated, they may not have been luminously clear to you when you heard them so rapidly. Therefore, I shall remedy that by rearranging these statements in sequence. Shall human beings pursue and complete all the efforts that are required in order to recover from the Caligastia betrayal and the default of Adam and Eve? Yes. Shall humanity embark on the even longer series of adjustments that will return Urantia to the ranks of inhabited planets entirely in good standing, so that our remote descendants will eventually benefit from the visible presence of accredited representatives of the spiritual government of the universe of universes? Yes. Shall human life on Urantia progress in even more fundamental ways that will justify the complete confidence of our celestial supervisors in the ultimate evolutionary triumph of the human race and the eventual vindication of the original plans and life patterns that the life carriers prepared? Yes, we can and do affirm that with complete conviction. Thus, my three answers are yes, yes, and yes, in that order, but you are entirely free to rearrange them in any other sequence that you happen to prefer. Right now, however, you and I shall simply resume our series of intriguing online seminars. Well, gentlemen, and our audience that certainly we hope includes ladies as well as gentlemen, we have now come to the end of my personal statement. As I indicated at the beginning of it, it does not oblige you. You are free to take issue with anything I have said to whatever degree you may find appropriate. And therefore, I yield to you for your personal comments and reactions. And I now recognize the first of our colleagues for that opportunity, George.
Thank you, Neil. First, thanks for this excellent thought-provoking essay on the larger purpose of this endeavor, which is to stimulate greater interest in the book's non-spiritual contents. Your first point in the paper, in the essay, is the obvious but largely underappreciated fact that the revelation we are studying is not purely spiritual. It's spiritual, mindal, and material. From my own observations, I find I agree with you that a majority of students appear to be primarily focused on its spiritual contents. This appears to incline them to view the Urantia book as a continuation of Christianity, which is clearly not the case. As you note, the fundamental tenet of the atonement doctrine in Christianity causes an appalling distortion of the concept of God. So I agree, this tendency to emulate Christianity, which is a modern religion that overemphasizes, quote, the goodness of God to the relative exclusion of truth and neglect of beauty, end quote, does promote a level of disinterest in the book's non-spiritual contents. You list it as an example of its spiritual content, the considerable information on the physical universe. I can actually personally attest to the lack of general lack of interest in this area. For the last 6 years, I have made several attempts to stimulate interest in the book's cosmology. Its concept of a God-centered cosmos, what might be called the geocentric model of the universe, is astonishingly original, spiritually appealing, philosophically coherent, and scientifically justifiable. For the first time, mankind is told where paradise is. A perfecter of wisdom informs us, quote, we all know the direct course to pursue to find the universal Father. It is just as possible to find the personal presence of God at the center of all things as to find distant cities on your own planet, end quote. I really can't figure out exactly why these presentations on this cosmology appears to have stimulated so little interest, but I believe you identify at least part of the reason. in your essay. The general disinterest in the book's non-spiritual content. But to be fair, this narrow focus on the religious content of the book is justifiable in a certain sense. Midwayers do tell us, quote, of all human knowledge, that which is of greatest value is to know the religious life of Jesus and how he lived it, end quote. So from this perspective, all other knowledge in the book is diminished in value. With regard to the instructive value of his religious life, the Midwayers tell us, quote, the master desires that all his followers should fully share his transcendent faith. Jesus most touchingly challenged his followers not only to believe what he believed, but also to believe as he believed, end quote. Jesus challenges us to believe what he believed about God, as well as to share his faith in God. So what exactly did Jesus believe about God? What was his actual concept of God? This is not so easy to determine, although we know it is not the same as the Christian concept. Further down in paper 96, from which these quotes have been taken, is a section titled The Supremacy of Religion, in which the Midwayers give us some guidance on answering this question. There are 3 quotes here. There are just 3 elements in universal reality: fact, idea, and relation. The religious consciousness identifies these realities as science, philosophy, and truth. The progressive comprehension of reality is the equivalent of approaching God. The experiencing of total reality is the full realization of God, the finality of the God-knowing experience. And third, religion is man's supreme gesture, his magnificent reach for final reality, his determination to find God and to be like him. So the finality of the God-knowing experience is the experiencing of total reality, which must include all spiritual, mindful, and material realities. So it appears Jesus's concept of God must be equivalent to the concept of total reality. But what do the Midwayers mean by the phrase, quote, the experiencing of total reality, end quote? The concept of God as total reality is not the same as personally knowing God, the experiencing of total reality. The Midwayers remark, man's contact with the highest objective reality, God, is only through the purely subjective experience of knowing him, of worshiping him, of realizing sonship with him. And end quote. So the spiritual presence of God is known in the personal experience of worshiping him. This spiritual experience is related to and dependent upon the philosophic concept of God as total reality. In paper 105, Melchizedek counsels us about the relationship between this spiritual presence and this philosophic concept. Quote, ever remember that man's comprehension of the universal Father is a personal experience. God as your spiritual Father is comprehensible to you and to all other mortals. But your experiential, worshipful concept of the universal Father must always be less than your philosophic postulate of the infinity of the first source and center, the I am, end quote. The divine counselor says in another place, quote, we simply worship God for what we comprehend him to be, end quote. The same holds for us, since God is personally comprehensible to us. However, our experiential, worshipful concept of the Father necessarily depends on exactly what we comprehend him to be. This dependence means the spiritual experience of worship is limited by the philosophic concept of the total reality of God, the infinite first source and center, the I am. The concept of God as total reality is advanced by all of the teachings in this revelation. As this personal concept of God advances, the potential for the realization of the spiritual presence of God increases. So I agree with your three affirmations at the end of the essay. I believe this world will attain the era of light and life, when the chief pursuit will be, quote, the quest for a better understanding and a fuller realization of the comprehensible elements of deity, truth, beauty, and goodness, end quote. This is when mankind will be, quote, increasingly absorbed in the experiential study of philosophy, cosmology, and divinity, end quote. And I think this progress, or progress towards this ultimate goal, involves the new concept of religion found in the very last section of the book, the supremacy of religion. In the current concept, religion is the domain of faith and spiritual experience. The new concept of the supremacy of religion expands this domain beyond the experience of faith to include the experiential wisdom of philosophy and the experiential reasoning of science. In this new concept, the experiential study of philosophy, cosmology, and divinity is integrated. In this supreme concept, religion encompasses the whole truth of the total reality of God. So this supreme concept of religion should cause the world to move away from religious divisions and toward the ideal of spiritual unity realized in light and life. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you very much, George, for an extremely interesting and indeed eloquent set of comments. I turn to you, Stephen, now for your turn at comments.
Thank you, George. That was very good. Neil, I thought I was going to be bored listening to reading 16-page essay, but I wasn't. So that says something about the quality of your essay. So thank you for that. Okay, there's several sections, issues here. I'm not sure I'll get to all of them, but on page 4 of your essay, you ask these questions that are, I guess, are not really rhetorical. Is the fifth epical revelation an outgrowth of Christianity? No. Is the revelation an appendix to Christianity? No. Well then, does the fifth epical revelation amount to Christianity 2.0? No, most certainly not. So let's admit for argument's sake that I'm going to use the abbreviation you don't like. Let's admit for argument's sake that the FER is not an outgrowth, appendix, or 2.0 version of Christianity. Although I think it's more accurate to use Judeo-Christianity as a relevant rubric here. But that admission does little to answer the question that is really being asked. What is the relationship between the Urantia book and the Christian religion? That there is a relationship, and a significant one, is undeniable. This as yet undefined relationship is unavoidable because of what the revelators tell us about the nature of revelation on Urantia and how it is necessarily involved with prior evolutionary forms of socialized religion. This relationship involves, at a minimum, articulation, expansion, and correction of existing religions by revelation. I'll read some quotes from the book. Paper 93, section 7. A new revelation is always contaminated by the older evolutionary beliefs. Paper 101, section 5. Revelation is a technique whereby ages upon ages of time are saved in the necessary work of sorting and sifting the errors of evolution from the truths of spirit acquirement. Paper 144, section 7. Always does the socialized religion of a new revelation pay the price of compromise with the established forms and usages of the preceding religion which it seeks to salvage. Paper 89, section 9. Paul's theologic compromises indicate that even revelation must submit to the graduated control of evolution. Paper 101, section 9. Revelation unfailingly enlarges the ethical horizon of evolved religion, while it simultaneously and unfailingly expands the moral obligations of all prior revelations. We may choose whether to discuss how to best characterize the relationship between the Urantia book and Christianity, but I believe it can be safely established that Christianity, the primary socialized religion manifested from the fourth epical revelation, and the FER have an integral relationship that needs to be further defined. So when you try to use a word like appendix or outgrowth or Christianity 2.0, these are single terms, single words that can't be expected to encompass or adequately describe a complex relationship between revelational and evolutionary religion. So to use single words and just say yes or no is not really being fair to the issue at hand. It needs to be explored much more comprehensively and not superficially. So I just want to mention a couple of other aspects of this. The fifth epical revelation was created with the cooperation of a group of human beings called the Forum, all of whom considered themselves to be Christians, and Protestants in particular. As surely as Jesus, being Jewish, influenced the nature and flavor of the fourth epical revelation, the social religious context associated with the birth of the Urantia papers must have had an impact as well. Without going into detail here, it's not hard to discern the Reformation flavor of the Urantia book's theology and ecclesiology. Secondly, Dwayne Fall has created a paramony for the Urantia book and the Bible, last edition 2002. This included both testaments, and so Judeo-Christianity is the issue here. The paramony lists over 60,000 cross-references paralleling and harmonizing the Bible and the Urantia book. This averages out to 28.6 biblical references per page in the Urantia book. That is a relationship. How we describe it depends on further conversation, but it cannot be dismissed as peremptorily as you try to do on your page 4. Just very briefly about atonement. That's a good example of how the Reformation nature of the Urantia book is portrayed. Atonement doctrine cannot be adequately portrayed by using one permutation of the doctrine, which is called the penal substitution theory. Atonement has been understood in Christianity in many different ways, and I am guessing that if the revelation had been presented to a forum composed of Eastern Orthodox Christians and or liberal Protestants, the nature of the description of atonement doctrine would most probably have been quite different. There's no single interpretation of atonement that encompasses what Neil has called the traditional Christian faith per se. There are several different theories of atonement, only one of which dominates in evangelical Protestant sects in America, which is what the book focuses on. And that is, I've talked about that before. that is an inaccurate presentation of what the atonement doctrine has been in Christianity in very different forms. There's another section about teachings about Jesus, and that gets into pretty complicated hermeneutics, I guess you'd say. So I'm going to let that go, and maybe I'll get a chance to talk about it later. But I'll leave it at that. So thank you.
Well, thank you for your many viewpoints. As I have remarked to you on quite a few previous occasions, you are definitely a resource for pluralism and diversity, and I appreciate your insights. Andre, it's your turn.
I'm not sure that I have as comprehensive a response as those that preceded me. I really appreciate both Stephen's and George's comments. There were a few things that struck me, and maybe I'll just for now comment on one of them. One was, first of all, it was a wonderful essay. I agree with them. This was really stimulating of a lot of different thought. What I'm interested in, particularly, is maybe just responding to one thing that you talked about, and that was where you had been speaking about let's see. Well, first of all, a couple of things. One, where the Melchizedek declares, and you're talking on page 21, there is great hope for any church that worships the living God, validates the brotherhood of man, and dares to remove all creedal pressure from its members. That seems to be some of the crux of what we're dealing with here, is that we're largely dealing with belief-based religion. And the transition from belief-based religion, and speaking of organized religion, to religion that will have ministers fostering among its members the personal spiritual experience with God, and socializing that so that individuals are learning from each other how their brethren are growing in their relationship with God, as opposed to learning moral precepts that are essentially non-dynamic, static moral precepts, cookie cutter precepts that no longer can be applied to many of the situations which we encounter, and thereby are fairly useless to most people. Hence, you have people that have no interest in being part of a church, and churches are losing membership. This gives, to me, hope. It also speaks to the nature of Urantia organizations, and that they ought not to introduce any creedal pressure on their members. And I speak to this not because as a theory, although largely we don't experience this, but even if there is something, for instance, like the publication mandate among certain members or certain adherents to the teachings of the Urantia revelation has become creedal, is something to be adhered to, even though in some quarters it's regarded as apocryphal. So I want to point that out. There was also something, and I'm sorry I didn't make a note as to exactly where this was. But the only other thing I'd like to comment on now was the idea that George so eloquently was referring to, but was stated very nicely in your essay. And it had to do, oh boy, I wish I could find it quickly. But it had to do with the idea that we would be studying art and literature and all these other things instead of just moral precepts. And I'm sorry, I'm not finding what page that was on. It was well stated. I think it was a quote from the book. But it has to do with the fact that I don't see how we win adherence to, and I'm not talking about to the Urantia revelation. I don't see how we win adherence to a new progressive spirituality that people want to socialize unless we do that, unless we appeal to whole persons and appeal to both the scientific, philosophic, and true spiritual leanings, meaning true growth towards spiritual realities as practiced by individuals. There has to be something that fosters intimacy among people. There has to be something that allows people to get to know each other on a basis of reality. And the idea of whether or not you are adhering to a particular set of moral principles is, on the face of it and at bottom, a dividing principle. That's how it's worked. That's how it continues to work. It's why we are a sect-divided Christianity. It's why virtually every religion that is belief-based is also sectarianly divided. And it's only as we are going to be able to get people, first of all, involved in a more holistic view of their relationship, both with God and with reality and with each other, and the encouragement of people getting to really know each other, that will really have a truly socialized religion. And that's what struck me. I don't have particular comments on everything that you were speaking about. This is really what it evoked in me, though. And I thank you for, again, just a wonderful essay.
Thank you, Andre, for your very kind comments. In particular, you were trying to identify the context that I believe correlates with the quotation appearing at the top of page 2 of my essay, which indeed comes from section 7 of paper 2 by the Divine Counselor. The failure to associate the goodness of God with the factual truths of science and the appealing beauty of art. And at the end of that same paragraph, the Divine Counselor calls for equal consideration to the truths of science, philosophy, and spiritual experience, the beauties of physical creation, the charm of intellectual art, and the grandeur of genuine character achievement. I think this is the passage that you were searching for in your question, in your comments. Okay, so thank you. We now have had 3 reactions, and I turn to the person who ends up 4th in this list of august colleagues, and that is Marvin.
Thank you, Neil. I had a few thoughts I was going to share, and then since others have spoken, I have a couple in relation to what has already been said. Some in relation to what Stephen said, which I appreciate everyone's comments, George, Steve, and Andre. I enjoyed Stephen's. I think they spread the frames of the picture that you've quite stimulatingly shared with us, Neil, in your essay. Stephen expands the frames, I think, and challenges some of them in ways that I find worthwhile. I want to start with a reaction to what Andre said about, and this is a general theme, and I want to draw a distinction that I don't think has been. I think you teased it, Andre, but I want to focus on it more frontally, and that is the distinction between belief-based religious traditions or doctrinally based religious traditions, and what Jesus called a new kind of religion. And I think he is still, with the fifth epical revelation, calling for the emergence, the evolution of a new kind of religion that is not belief-based, in essence. It is primarily relationship-based. It doesn't flow from a set of intellectual constructs. It flows from a set of living relationships that we have vertically and horizontally, vertically with God and horizontally with all other human beings. And what Jesus was saying is, you can't think out your religion. You must live your religion, and you live it in the context of these living, dynamic, ever-changing, emerging relationships, one with the deity, with the creator that made you, and being in a live relationship moment to moment, ideally, with that presence, and being in a loving and dedicated service relationship, nurturing, mutual support relationship with ideally all other human beings and celestial beings progressively beyond this life. So so that's point one, is the distinction between belief-based religion and relational religion, which I don't think has yet existed on this world, and which Jesus is calling us to. He called his apostles to develop such a religion, and they succeeded to some extent and failed to some extent. And he's calling us to attempt the same thing evolutionarily. And the section that we read on, one of my favorite sections, you're well aware, is the nature of cultism. What the revelators are saying must yet be evolved is a symbolic spiritual culture, an actual culture, a way of being, a way of living with each other and with God that has emphases and customs and ways of proceeding, but that are focused not on belief, but on relationship and on the enrichment, the spiritualization of our relationships. So that's point one. Couple of other points in response to your document, Neil, about the Christianity issue and the appeal in some sectors of our movement primarily to Christianity, and that should be the focus of our primary ministry and outreach effort. I'm in agreement with you, Neil. I think it's limiting, and I think it's also it has hazards associated with it. I think there are two parallels in the two major errors that the early Christians made that you articulated, Neil. There are parallels to our situation with the fifth epical revelation. The first error was on the attempt of the early Christians to appeal to Judaism and to Jewish believers to bring them into the fold, and it was in that attempt that Paul appended the sacrificial doctrine, the atonement, and stepped it up a level to the atonement doctrine, and which is a distortion of the nature of God, and waits to be remedied. So I think the first error is an appeal to an existing religious context exclusively or inordinately that distorts the purity of the revelation that's being given. And I actually think we face a parallel error in that, and it's well developed in our movement heretofore. We're 80, 90 years into this movement, and the primary culture of our movement is focused on this text. We read the text, we study the text, we're preoccupied with the text, we spread the text. It's primarily a religion about a book. And most of the people that encounter it, that's the impression that they probably come away with. And so the parallel error there is that the evolutionary movement coming out of this revelation will end up being the revelation about the religion about the Urantia book rather than the religion of the Urantia book. as Christianity is a religion about the person of Jesus, which is central to their cult, to their culture, rather than the religion of Jesus, which he so strongly warned his followers to avoid that error. So we run a similar risk. The second error, I'm sorry, I think I've articulated the two errors. One is to appeal primarily to Christianity, as the early Christians tried to appeal primarily to Jewish followers. And the second error is to focus on the religion about Jesus versus religion of Jesus, and that we face a similar risk in being unduly focused in our evolving culture on the religion about the Urantia book, rather than the spirituality of the Urantia book, the core thrust of it. And I want to go back to the theme of the relationship-based, belief-based religion. And I want to go back to the top of your page 13, Neil. And I want to read the paragraphs there, the first paragraph in particular. Instead, the role of a teacher must be reoriented and redefined. Rather than attempt to impart facts, theories, or interpretations, a teacher should endeavor to evoke, enhance, and reinforce a lifelong commitment to learning and personal growth, a commitment that features an inquiring mind and an active search for new meanings and values, a search that entails consistent and persistent exploration. In principle, this is not very different from what Socrates was endeavoring to achieve in ancient Athens. And I want to take issue with that. As lofty as it is, I think it's an extension of the religion of the book, the religion about the book. And it's about ideas and beliefs, and it's about intellectual expansion and extrapolation and exploration, that our leaders of our evolutionary movement must be thinkers and discussers and conversers. And I think we're missing the heart of what Jesus is saying, and what this revelation is saying is that it's all about changed way of living and a changed way of relationships. It's not, it has many intellectual components, but the heart of the transformation that the text is and the revelators are asking us to try and address culturally in our evolutionary efforts is a change in the way we live and the way we relate to God and the way we relate to each other, so that our lives primarily become a set of living relationships in the family of God, that we love each other in that manner. We minister to each other in that manner, and we care about the whole in that manner. And that's what should drive our evolutionary religious development out of this revelation, is a spiritually driven way to live in these changed relationships, not simply a different way of understanding things, but a different way of living things and becoming someone different, becoming transformed mortal beings, to live as sons and daughters of God much more fully. So there's that point. The last point I want to make is, and it's a difficulty I have. I honor your intent, Neil, and what you're attempting to do with the endeavor that we're engaged in here. But I want to share a metaphor that I've often used in my therapeutic work with folks. And to me, it reflects a principle in the Urantia book, a couple of different places, where they say that Jesus in Rome ignored the errors, the erroneous approaches of the leaders that he spoke with there. He let them have them, and he focused on finding where there was the truth, the leading edge of their growth, and emphasizing it and growing it in the expectation that the fallacies would fall away. And in another place in the Urantia book, they say that the philosophy of Jesus is where he emphasized falling in love with a higher spiritual truth or reality, and not grappling or analyzing or struggling with the errors, but letting them sort of fall away naturally, as the focus was primarily on the higher reality that gets embraced. And for me, I have a metaphor that I've used in practice called the colored monkeys analogy. And it has to do with the way human minds work, right? If I say to you all, I want you not to think of an orange monkey, what are you doing? You're grappling with, you're trying to oppose an orange monkey, right? And you're thinking, if I say to you, I'd like you to clear your mind and visualize a bright blue glowing monkey flapping his arms vigorously and jumping up and down, right? If you can see that, are you thinking of an orange monkey now? No, right? The nature of human thinking is if you focus on trying not to do something, you become more and more mired in what it is you're trying to leave behind, right? So this emphasis of Jesus on the positive, reach for the higher and the lower will fall away. I think this endeavor to delegitimize the efforts of people in our movement, to primarily work with Christianity, is just not particularly productive. What we should be doing really is primarily focusing on the positive task that they enjoin us to address, which is the evolution of a symbolic spiritual culture that embodies the teachings of Jesus in new and upstep form, that is uh, profoundly relational. It's all about our relationships and living differently. Um, and if we do that, then both the attempt of some of us to reach out primarily to Christianity and the attempt to be inordinately intellectually based will simply, they won't prevail, because the driving reality of these changed ways of living and relationship will carry forward, and error will fall away of its own accord. Um, so I guess I'll just leave us no surprise to you with the preoccupation I've had for decades, really, which is, let's be about the business described in section 87.7. Let's, as a movement, focus, partially at least, some substantial energies on the evolution of spiritual culture that focuses on the gospel as they're asking us to newly present it in terms of parent-child relationship with God and sister-brother relationship with each other on a global and universal basis, and move forward with that symbolism, which I do believe is the higher symbolism of the higher civilization that our culture so desperately needs in the midst of this period of transition.
Thank you, Marvin. You've been very interesting in your comments, delving into many aspects. I think, as in the case of your other colleagues, there are aspects of your reactions that you and I personally, one-on-one, could clarify and discuss in considerable depth. I don't have the option of doing that under these circumstances, in which I must respect the responses of all of you. I appreciate the diversity that you bring to the discussion. At some point, I think your comments and those of Stephen touch on certain characteristics of the interest in the Urantia book that has been developed over the last 3 generations approximately. And in relation to the comments that Stephen made about taking on or dealing with the results of previous adaptations, I've long wondered to what degree the custom of study groups inherits the psychology and sociology of Bible study in the Protestant tradition, and how that has been influential, or maybe it hasn't been. But it would be a productive subject to discuss at some point, and I'm certainly not asking you to talk about it now. I'm simply saying that this idea of continuity and residual effect of a tradition of observance and practice is part of what I think our movement has become or is at this point. In any event, I'm sorry to dilate a little bit on some of the ideas that you expressed. I will concede to you that I managed to arrange the sequence of events so that you would have the opportunity personally to read some of the passages from section 7 of paper 87. And I knew that would be appealing to you. Now I'm going to turn to our colleague who has not yet spoken. I would say that in my preliminary messages about the order of business, I commented to Bob that positioning him as the cleanup hitter was not an implication that there would be a mess left by one or other of you that he would have to clean up, but he could comment on that if he wishes. In any case, I turn over to Bob. with his comments.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, the baseball metaphor works for me very well. The cleanup hitter typically has some data coming back from the batters in front of them. Maybe they've struck out, maybe they got singles. Everybody seemed to really clean the bases up here. So it's definitely not the same kind of metaphor where I have to drive everybody home. But it was quite instructive for me. So full disclosure, Neil sent me the draft, and I was able to make some comments back to him, which there were a couple of small changes Neil made in the original draft. So I've had an opportunity to read that, and I do agree with everybody that now that I've had the opportunity to sit back and kind of think through this a little bit, it's a little harder to read a draft and try to get in and give some salient thoughts about it. And I certainly appreciate everybody's comments. I want to go back and talk about a couple of those because I found a little bit of a thread that might make sense. If the pitcher is throwing outside all the time and the umpire is calling strikes out there, that's the feedback that the cleanup hitter gets, so that he or she is able to, know that you got to cover the outside of the base. So here's a couple of thoughts that I had now that I didn't have on the draft. The paper is directed to current Urantia book student readers. Now, I'm not clear whether it should be directed to long-term readers, because the movement, as everybody has spoken about, Marvin brought it up, has got quite a few years under its belt. Newer readers, not exactly sure what the modus operandi is, if they're actually going to part 4 and just going through, at least on the Western side, from Latin America and North America, and just staying away from the hard stuff. So the paper's theme was, and it presented a paradox that I don't think we've really fleshed out here, although Neil did bring this up in the beginning part about it. And that is, we're spending a lot of time on topic 8, which is comparing and contrasting part 4 with the teachings of Christianity. But the paradox is that, we really want to get to the hard stuff. We really want to get to the cosmology, to the cosmic consciousness, to the truth, beauty, and goodness, not just the righteousness of what we see, or what we've talked about in previous webinars about where the Bible and Christianity tends to spend, Judeo-Christianity, as Steve brought up, tends to drive just the righteousness, with the exclusion of truth and beauty. So the paradox is that we probably should have topic 8 as a very short topic, yet we're spending a whole heck of a lot of time. So a paradox is when, if there's a couple definitions, but a paradox is when two apparent contradictory statements appear to be true. So it's true that, many of the, or it seems as though that the significant abundance of the way that the current and previous history of the students of the Urantia revelation are that part 4 is the focus. And I have to say that in our current group, I join every Tuesday over phones now. We don't get together personally. The preference is to read part 4, which is the life and teachings of Jesus. I remember Bill Sadler Jr. saying in one of the discussions that he gave to the societies is that we need to go to part 4 to explain what that hard stuff is in the beginning of in parts 1, 2, and 3. And maybe that's true. Maybe there is some truth to that. Are these two actually going to be integrated in some way? As George brought up, the non-spiritual content. I'm not exactly sure I know what the non-spiritual content is. There's some, I thought I knew it as soon as you mentioned it, George, that sure, if I went to paper 16, for example, and it talks about cosmic mind and these cosmic constituents, which are all part of the cosmic mind, these natural constituents, these scientific, moral, and spiritual insights, these cosmic responses are innate in the cosmic mind, which endows all will creatures. The experience of living never fails to develop these three cosmic intuitions. They are constitutive in the self-consciousness of reflective thinking. Here's the statement that really gets me, and it's gotten me for quite some time. But it is sad to record that so few persons on your ranch yet take delight in cultivating these qualities of courageous and independent cosmic thinking. So there's a lot of non-spiritual content, I suppose. Jesus certainly has a lot of spiritual content, and I think that's the juxtaposition that we have here. Steve brought up a very interesting point that I hadn't really considered, that the paramony has 60,000 cross-references, or 28.6. I had no idea this was the case, Steve. References from the Bible on each page in the Urantia book. That's pretty significant. But at the same time, this cosmic thinking is something that has to be developed with all the religions, as well as the philosophical religions that we're going to that it should approach in the East. One comment that I think was a theme that Marvin, you brought this up, and I've been saying this a few times, is that, okay, if the focus is on Christianity 2.0, for example, if that's how these long-term readers do see the papers, what's the methodology? And I contend, as Marvin, as you did, is that to spend the time focusing on the error, for example, the atonement concept, which I've taken to heart and said, look, it seems as though that the universal censor who writes about this, or no, I'm sorry, it was a divine counselor writes, and it's one of the very few times that the papers speak in a strong fashion, almost a negative fashion, such as that the atonement concept is a true constraint to cosmic consciousness. And I've always felt that, and I still think that's the case. Steve, you did bring up a very interesting point that I hadn't really had any concept of, that there are various ways to think about atonement. And if that's the case, and I think I'm going to have to reflect on that a little bit, then we need to take some issue with how we would approach and what the methodology is. There was a theme that came through, I think, not only in what you wrote, Neil, but in what everybody picked up, and that is teachers, leaders, methodology for being able to develop a way to provide the higher truths that you spoke about, Marvin, that would crowd out the error, as Jesus did with the Cynics and the Stoics that he spent some time with in at least a couple to 6 months, I think, when he was in Rome. Found that to be very interesting. It never spent time on the error, but did spend time on the higher truths and push those out. Well, those higher truths are obviously in the first 3 parts, if not in part 4, but they're clearly those what we should consider is maybe non-spiritual. However, as I got thinking about it, this idea of matter, mind, and spirit as being the correlates of truth, beauty, and goodness, to be able to think cosmically, I've got to be able to put all 3 together. But there is one aspect of our reality that the papers develop that I think is close to pure revelation, and that is the idea of personality as being the primary delegation of the 2 delegations that the Father doesn't delegate. He delivers personality when he wants, and the thought adjusters have a specific set time, rough set of time when moral discernment and the first moral decision is made by an individual. Those are the two things that the Father doesn't delegate, except the attorney in fact for the infinite spirit on personality. The methodologies are really going to be important here. And I think that maybe that's where this has to focus, is on process. There's one interesting type concept that I think, Neil, you brought this up, and it was a theme. This is the last one I wanted to bring up here to say that all of us seem to think about this, is that to not push creedal pressure is almost similar to the way that secular education, which should be just a character, should not only impart knowledge, but should also develop character development, should stay away, religions as well as that should stay away from any creedal pressure. There's an interesting concept that I think I'll bring up here. It's more of a tactic, I suppose. It's called the jigsaw groups. And if you have a proper size group, jigsaw groups take a topic, and each individual that's in the group has to teach one of the topics, has to do research and teaches it to that group. They then jigsaw out, and those that just learn that information then have to go back and teach it to the other groups. It sounds complicated, but it's very simple, and it certainly is a way that I think going forward, teachers and leaders ought to be thinking about how not to apply creedal pressure, but to be able to develop a dynamic learning mechanism or sharing of experiences on the religious side of the house. So, Neil, as everybody said, it was a very stimulating paper. You presented a paradox that I don't think we have a solution to yet, but I think we do have to spend more time on topic 8, because in fact, we do need to understand more of what Steve brought up, and that is, what is the relationship between the Urantia papers and Christianity? It was delivered into a Western Christian group. So we need to consider that, and won't have an answer here tonight, of course, but we should spend some more time reflecting upon it and trying to come up with some solutions. And the other one was, I think I brought the other one out. Yes, here's the last thought I had. George brought up this idea of experiencing total reality. And that's the real hard stuff. Being able to spend as much time as possible in relating it back to part 4 from the early parts of the papers. Most people are interested in spiritual content. That's certainly the fact. But if you follow George's presentation at the science symposium, there isn't any doubt that it's a God-centered cosmos. So how does that become non-spiritual? I don't know yet, but I do understand the difference in language that we have to use for that, and that's certainly the case. So Neil, again, thanks for a stimulating paper. It did take the entire webinar, but it was a really great start for us to get back on track here and to get back into topic 8 with our paradox of spending a little bit more time on topic 8 than planned. Thank you. Back to you, Neil.
You're muted, Neil. You're muted. Neil, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Let me see if I can unmute Neil. There you go. Okay.
All right. I would thank you for your many comments. They did not amount to cleaning up any mess that others might have left. I would say that you've added to the complications rather than resolve them. But that indeed has been the prerogative of each of you. Now, Marvin told me separately that he has another commitment that will cause him to unplug very shortly. Am I correct about that, Marvin?
Yeah, yeah. I've got one brief comment to add before I take off.
So in addition to being last in, first out, you want to have the last word. All right, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sure it won't be the last word. It's really in relation to the people in our movement who not only feel a calling to reach out, particularly to Christianity, but are doing so, and with some effect. And it's happening in a few different sectors. And you know, my feeling is we have a diverse readership, a diverse following of this fifth epical revelation, and people are sincere and will have a sense of calling, I guess is the best way for me to put it. And I don't think it's any of our prerogatives to question their sense of calling, because you know, I think it comes out of a sense of their prayerful relationship with God and their sense of how God and God's agencies are leading them to minister. And I think numbers of us will feel called to minister, in particular to the interface or the interrelation, as Stephen described it, between this new revelation and its relationship and impact and involvement with the evolving Christian religion. And I think others will feel similar callings in regards to Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism, and some will feel particular callings to interfaith work and the evolution of that whole movement. And some of us, me right in there, will really feel called to primarily to address the evolution of a unique and new spiritual culture grounded in a spiritual family relationship that seems to reflect more effectively the theology of the Urantia book and corrects much of some of the errors of the Christian cult. So we all have our different callings, and I don't think what we're doing here or anything in the Urantia movement is going to convince someone who has a calling to drop it and not do it anymore. I haven't seen any sign of that happening. So I think we should be gracious and appreciative of each other's sense of calling. And, you know, as sort of like, as Gamliel said, you know, if it's not of God, it will drop away. And as Margaret Wheatley said, you know, there's an energy to chaotic development, and where there's spiritual driving power, according to different people's leading, energy will gather and things will evolve and develop and grow. And probably not least because the angels are in support of things that our celestial helpers want to see developed. And so we can depend on that happening. But I think the idea that it should happen in one particular way and not in other ways is hazardous. I think it's going to be happening, at least in these first few hundred years, on many different fronts. And then we'll sort of see what evolves and develops over time. And hopefully we'll have a better track record than what's happened with Christianity, although it's certainly accomplished a lot. So my guess is generations hence, folks will look back on the efforts that have sprung from this latest revelation and have a similar appraisal, which was so many good things have emerged out of it, but there were mistakes made. And so we're just part of that mix.
Marvin, thank you for these concluding remarks. If you have to disappear like Cinderella's coach, then I give you the blessing for that.
Right.
For those of you who are prepared to remain for another few minutes, I would like to take the first paragraph on page 7 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Can I ask Stephen to read that first paragraph on page 7 entitled The Presence of God? You're muted, Stephen.
The presence of God. In the final analysis, God is in, around, over, under, and through us. Although this includes the fact that a thought adjuster lives in the mind of each human being who is conscious of right and wrong, that definitely does not exhaust the reality of God's presence. After all, a divine counselor tells us in paper 1, in him we all live and move and have our being. On the other hand, in paper 5, he concedes, it is well nigh impossible for human logic and finite reason to harmonize the concept of divine immanence, God within, and a part of every individual with the idea of God's transcendence, the divine domination of the universe of universes. Divine Counselor, paper 69, section 1. No, paper 5, section 5, paragraph 6. This may be as far as we should go, for this second statement suggests that attempting to probe the philosophical implications is not likely to be productive.
Thank you. I would simply put this to the group for preliminary consultation and comment. It seems to me that, in effect, these two ideas are being presented by the revelators as both valid and true, and they are saying, in effect, that we have trouble getting our minds across them at the same time. Saying that we have trouble getting our minds across them doesn't mean that they are false. It merely has to do with the realities of our limited understanding. I wonder if Andre might be willing to share any observations about that. You're muted, Andre.
I was very intrigued, just with that the statements about immanence and transcendence again, and how, in general, we tend to have a lot of focus in our world on the transcendent aspects of deity and not the immanent aspects of deity. And in fact, some of the source authors whom the revelators, relied upon, had beliefs that, I'm thinking of Henry Wyman particularly, had beliefs that were inimical to the idea of an immanent God, to the idea of a thought adjuster, and yet presented such wonderful ideas that the revelators included them in many parts of the papers. And my thoughts around that are that some of our challenges are that currently we have in various quarters, especially in the first world, a self-satisfied populace that is not really hungry enough to make the effort to try to reconcile disparate concepts and to try to understand that which is difficult. It takes hunger, in my opinion. It takes a desire to want to do that, to first attack it. And that hunger is which may not be in, say, North America or Europe right now, is there in various quarters of the third world, in Latin America and in the Philippines, where if you look at some of the growth of the revelation there, see people that have very few means that are hungry for what the Urantia book has to teach. I think what we need to pay attention to is to, and I'm sorry that I'm all over the map with this, but see where the fields are white for the harvest, and understand that it may not be where our light is currently shining. Like the analogy of the man who dropped his keys and is looking under the street lamp, and somebody says, what are you looking for? I'm looking for my keys. Well, where did you drop them? Well, I dropped them over there across the parking lot. Well, why are you looking here? Well, this is where the light is shining. And that tends to be how we approach things. You know, we can't really function too far outside of our consciousness, but by socializing and by our efforts here, by paying attention to what others of us are paying attention to, we may think outside of our own boxes. And I thank you again for this essay, which got us out of the box. And I'll just share as an aside, your thoughts on marriage and how those were dominated, which haven't been really commented on by anybody. I didn't want to miss the opportunity to state, I think that your treatment of that, both as it was dominated by ecclesiastical authority and how moving out of the moralization on that would be a solution for the United Methodist Church at this juncture, was a brilliant line of reasoning. And I really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. I appreciate your concluding comments, which indeed went back to a part of my essay. I believed when I wrote that this dilemma confronting the United Methodist Church is a vivid example of the heritage of traditions of Christianity that people do not understand, but that has simply become so natural and so automatic that they don't realize that that was a choice. And it was a deliberate strategy long ago, around the year 1000. George, I'd like to ask you about the implications of the paragraph at the top of page 7 in relation to a point that Andre has just referred to. He talked about other parts of the world, immanence perhaps being more important. Are we implicitly discussing a consequence of the Western facility for transcendence as opposed perhaps to the idea of immanence, God around us, that we are in him, that perhaps may be stronger in other cultures?
Well, perhaps, but to go back to that sentence, couple of sentences that Stephen read off about the immanence and transcendence of God, in the very next sentence, there's a very important point, which says, quote, "These two essential concepts of deity must be unified in the faith grasp of the concept of the transcendence of a personal God and in the realization of the indwelling presence of a fragment of that God in order to justify intelligent worship and validate the hope of personality survival." That really expands on the concept. I don't think any religion fits that bill. You know, the East, as has been mentioned, does appear to have a preference for, well, I guess, how can you say that when you talk about Hinduism and the concept of the Brahman and the Atman? They have a concept, except it's not personal, so there's no personal survival. I mean, the whole thing gets very mixed up. But if that second sentence is understood in the context of what is presented in the Urantia book, it becomes very understandable. There's no question about what the immanence of God means in the context of what we're studying. It's the thought adjuster. But I've encountered any number of people who are longtime students of the book who have well, let me phrase it differently. My concept of the transcendence of God is that he's a person dwelling on paradise at the center of the universe. To me, that's, yes, I can conceive of other ways in which God is transcendent, but that is the most immediate and direct sense in which he is transcendent, as I understand what is presented in the Urantia book. So I just wanted to bring up that point, because so many people I've talked to have said, well, no, that's not what it means. It means he's outside of space, he's beyond time. And, there are all of these essentially indescribable ideas that most of which come from Christianity, at least in North America, since it all flows down from the Catholic Church and the concept of paradise as dwelling outside of time and space, which was actually memorialized in the work of Dante. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think you persuaded me to leave it there. I realize that I've implicitly discriminated against Stephen and Bob by not giving them a chance to comment on this paragraph today, but we will definitely return to it at the time we convene again for our next webinar. Colleagues, I have greatly enjoyed our discussion. I take considerable pleasure in the fact that all of you reacted to my personal statement as the basis for very intriguing statements of your own. And so I believe that in my role as the moderator, my strategy of giving my own statement and then asking you to comment worked out, at least for the purposes of this webinar. But in the next webinar, we will return to our standard method, which I have in effect sought to exemplify by initiating discussion of the first paragraph on page 7 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. So thank you once again, gentlemen. We call it a day.
Okay, thank you.
Right,
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye,
Neil.
everybody.
Thank you, Stephen, George, and Bob.
See you all next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.